Hi, I'm Joe Burgo. This is the third in my series of videos about psychodynamic psychotherapy and what to expect. This one is going to deal with the beginning of the transference. Now, when most people think about the transference, they usually imagine something fairly dramatic, like falling in love with your therapist or becoming so dependent that your world begins to revolve around treatment. Those things may happen. They don't necessarily happen, but they may happen later on in therapy. But in the beginning, the kind of things that I might observe as early manifestations of the transference might not seem to you like they were transference interpretations at all. Now, the relationship between therapist and client is unique in its own ways, but in many respects it's a relationship just like any other one. You're the same person coming into treatment as you are outside, and you're going to bring your characteristic ways of relating to other people and interacting with you into the room. And I'm going to be noticing ways that you react to me, interact with me, and using those to learn something about you and hopefully show you something about yourself that you might not have noticed before. Now, when I was thinking about this video, I decided that the easiest way to explain this was to give a lot of examples. So I've brought some examples of transference interpretations I've made recently in the last couple of months, the sort of things that I do regularly as part of my work. And I thought I'd discuss those examples and how I use them. So the first one is a guy who came in who was very depressed and was having thoughts about suicide. So he was in a lot of pain. But I noticed as we went on that he would tell me horrible things about his past, deeply painful things about what had happened to him in a kind of jokey, lighthearted sort of way. And he'd call me Doc and joke around quite a bit. So I pointed this out to him and talked about it as a way not only to keep me at a distance, but also a way he kept himself at a distance from his pain by being lighthearted about it, making it into more kind of a charming anecdote than something deeply painful. That's a simple example. Another example is a guy who came in who was having a lot of trouble in his marriage. And he spent a lot of the first sessions explaining to me what a horrible person he was. And I eventually said to him, it seems to me like you're trying to convince me that you're really a bad person and that you ought to be punished. This led to some interesting things. First of all, about his marriage and the dynamics between him and his wife, where they really agreed that he was a bad person and that he should be punished. She totally supported that view and blamed him for everything. It also led us to some greater understanding of his own conscience, the brutality and kind of black and white nature of it, that it was very punitive. He was just bad and there was nothing to be done about him. He just had to be punished. The third example is a young woman who came in who was quite depressed. She wasn't cutting herself at the time of treatment, but that had been an issue in the past. So during session she was very timid, very soft-spoken, had a hard time getting out what she wanted to say, and seemed kind of afraid of me, was my impression. But then in between sessions, after a while, I started to get very angry emails in which she would accuse me of being insensitive, not listening to her, talking about my own ideas instead of hers, and really just not listening to her. So what this led us to understand was a number of things. First of all, a great deal of anger that she felt couldn't be dealt with. It was too dangerous to bring up in person. That was an issue in the self-injury that later came out. It also taught us something about her early experience, particularly her mother, who would never listen to her, invalidated her experience entirely. But most important, it led us into an understanding of a part of her own mind that really choked off her voice, would not allow her to speak, invalidate all of her experience, and basically just totally suppressed her. So those were ways in which my clients interacted with me in and out of session in ways that led us to understand something about their other relationships and about their own minds. Now, later on in treatment, issues of dependency will become more important. How you cope with need, how you respond to your awareness of neediness. You might have heard, if you read any of my other posts, you might have heard me talking about the infantile transference. That's something that doesn't always come up. It comes up in most long-term treatment from my experience. But even in the beginning, with some clients, issues of neediness and dependency come up right from the beginning. And I also have several examples of those that I want to talk about. The first was a woman who came to me after having been in treatment with somebody else for 4 or 5 years. She had been very dependent on that therapist and hated feeling that way. Hated that he mattered so much to her. And so right away she did not want to repeat that experience. So she started making excuses to miss session. She'd stop therapy and start it again. She'd decide to skip sessions, and this became her way of trying to regulate need and not let me matter very much to her. She eventually stopped coming altogether. Another example is a client of mine who is engaged in a lot of self-injuring kind of behavior. Pretty serious. She comes a couple of times a week, and yet she still needs to have contact between sessions because, all hope, all sense of goodness kind of disappears pretty quickly. So she will send me emails. They're very brief emails, just touching base, making contact with me, and yet she's continually worried that she's going to be too much for me, that I'll get sick of her, that I'll want to get rid of her, and on and on. And this tells us not only something about her past and the way nobody in her life was ever able to be there for her, to give her what she needed, to tolerate her neediness, but also about the way she hates her own neediness and wants to kill it off. That's a big part of the self-injury kind of behavior in which she tries to get rid of neediness and really kill it off. The third example is a man who has come in for kind of bipolar type issues. If you've seen my video on bipolar disorder, he fits that profile pretty clearly. And he sometimes comes into session and talks to me as if we're colleagues. He said, I feel like I'm in the room with another therapist and that we're talking about him, that other guy over there who's our patient, and we have to, discuss what to do about him. So I will point that out to him, and I will tell him that I think he'd rather be the therapist than the patient or the client, because it's so hard to be the client. In bipolar disorder, there's so much hopelessness about any kind of realistic growth. This fear that the damage is so severe that you can't really hope to ever grow in a realistic way or develop little by little over time. And the only way to do anything is magically, manically, to become, better all at once, or to become the therapist. Just be the therapist rather than to be dependent, needy in therapy over a long period of time. So those are some examples of how in the early transference issues of neediness and dependency will come up. So in these first few videos, I think I've covered the main issues that come up at the beginning of treatment. Now, you may be beginning to feel a little bit better now as you've settled into our relationship. You're feeling that somebody's there. You're feeling maybe a little bit hopeful. But at the same time, you're not feeling quite as desperate. possibly. You know, you're not feeling quite as, you know, in need of help as you were in the beginning. And as you do, you might find that you're turning to your old defenses as you used to do. You might not notice it that way, but it often happens. You know, people come to therapy because their defenses aren't working anymore, because their usual ways of coping have broken down. But as you stabilize, you tend to turn again to your old defenses, and you might not want to go so deeply into the pain that brought you into therapy in the first place. And that's when we begin to encounter the resistance. And that's going to be the subject of the next video, and I'll talk about it next time. Thanks for listening.